Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am fortunate and privileged to have Jonathan Rauch. Jonathan is the Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institute. He's the author of 8 books and has many articles on public policy, culture, and government. He's a contributing writer for The Atlantic and recipient of the 2005 National Magazine Award. He's written a few books, the most recent, The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. And that is the book we talk about in this conversation today. We start out this conversation by discussing some of his background and how we got to many of the themes that we have in society today. We talk about the distinctions that he makes between truth and knowledge. We talk about something he does really well in the book, which is how he modeled his idea of constitution of knowledge based off of the United States Constitution and using Madison's central thesis of compromise. We talk about how we scale the constitution of knowledge to mass amounts of people in the United States. We spend some time talking about the importance and value of institutions. We give a nice example in the middle of the conversation about gay rights as a way in which institutions were used to make change. Of course, there was plenty of activism, but also the use of institutions to make some pretty powerful changes for the gay community. We talk about some of the components of the Constitution of Knowledge. We talk about positive versus negative epistemic valence. We talk about how individuals and or identities and institutions need each other and must work together. We talk about troll epistemology and the remaining remnants of Trump's impact. And we talk about how we can use the Constitution of Knowledge pragmatically in society. It was really big honor to talk to Jonathan. His book is probably one of my favorite books that I've read this year. He is against illiberalism and really is a kind of beacon of hope for centrism and trying to say, how can we, work together in the spirit of compromise, have strong ideas, have strong opinions, but how do we, kind of push and challenge, but then also find agreements with each other instead of trying to, tear things down or try to make things worse. And so his insights are extremely valuable and extremely necessary in our society today. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. And so now I bring you Jonathan Rauch. I'm here with Jonathan Rauch. John, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's a big honor.
I'm happy to be here, Javier.
Yeah, thanks. So you've written a great book, The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. This is 2 weeks old? Is that right? Something like that? Not even.
June 22nd. So that's about 2 weeks.
Yeah. It's brilliant. I love it. I know you've been making the rounds and kind of plugging this, so I'm really excited to talk to you about it. So just real quick, just give us your elevator pitch, who you are, where you work, what you do, and we'll get into it.
My name is Jonathan Rauch. I'm a journalist by training. I'm a senior fellow at Brookings. Almost 30 years ago, I wrote a book called Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought, which I can say this without undue boasting. A lot of people regard it as a free speech classic now, and it's about where knowledge comes from in a society that's free and sane and knowledgeable. And so then I went away for a long time, worked on other issues like gay marriage and what was going wrong with politics. A few years ago, it started to get pretty obvious that we were headed toward what some people call an epistemic crisis, which is when people don't know what to believe or who to trust or what's true and what's not true. And they become polarized and extreme, often confused, kind of situation that can lead to strife, even civil war. And I began looking at the causes of that and wrote this book, which is about how we make knowledge, constitution of knowledge, the system we use, the settings we rely on, what they are, who the attackers are, and crucially, how to defend ourselves.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And, obviously more and more salient. I think you're right that there's, kind of this storm brewing. And I wonder if the advent of the internet and social media just kind of really, put it into right in front of us. And so, I have to imagine that's a big part of it as well.
Oh, yeah. It's a part, though. I think the tech is actually overemphasized. It's important. There's no question that having the ability to spread disinformation at the touch of a button, conspiracy theories, trolling, everything like that. This gives fantastic new potential and power to people who want to engage in various kinds of disinformation. But I don't think it's the main thing that happened, actually. I think the more important thing that happened was the rise of political factions that understood information warfare and were good at it. And we're also able to use traditional channels like conservative media. And the biggest change of all, unfortunately, this will sound partisan. I'm center right. I've voted for many Republicans, but biggest change of all was the rise of Donald Trump, who is the greatest information warrior since the 1930s, who figured out that you could apply Russian-style disinformation in U.S. politics and succeed brilliantly at it. Then converted the Republican Party to do it. That's completely new. And that's not just a function of tech. That's a function of having a genius level actor with the audacity and unscrupulousness to go ahead and do it.
Yeah, it reminds me, when I had a couple months ago now, I had Rick Perlstein on, and we talked a little bit about that and just how he's, Reagan was kind of the precursor to this, and then, Trump is just that messaging on steroids. And, you're right. He was very successful at completing that. So,
yeah. Just for what it's worth, I don't put Reagan and Trump in anything like the same bucket. I mean, I have agreements and disagreements with Reagan. On the whole, he's a politician I admire. What we're seeing now, the wholesale application of Russian-style disinformation, that's fire hose of falsehood tactics, where you swamp the system with so many lies and conspiracy theories and half-truths that no one can keep up. People get confused. The media gets lost. Or conspiracy bootstrapping, which is when you say, a lot of people are saying that X or Y. And then if you repeat it, if you report it, you're amplifying it. If you don't, then you're covering it up. Trolling, that's attention hijacking. That's where you say anything, doesn't matter what, but as long as it's outrageous enough, people can't ignore it. These are not things that Ronald Reagan did. These are not things that American politicians did. Trump is a different kind of thing than we've ever seen before. He is a Vladimir Putin style disinformation expert. Nothing like that in the past. So we have to view this, I think, as a break with the past, not as a continuation of the past.
No, that's a really good distinction. I think I would agree with that. I think it is. You're seeing a lot of these types of things that are happening. And so with, everything you just laid out, I totally agree with this kind of flooding of sorts of like just one thing to the next. So I think that we should be very mindful of how we can, tackle these things and understand it, which is really what you do in your book. So obviously I want people to read the book. I think it's great. So I guess the one thing I want to kind of start with is the subtitle is Defense of Truth. And so I guess one of my questions is, what truth are you alluding to, and how can we know truth? Obviously there's objective, subjective truth that can sometimes seemingly be at odds with each other. So how do you kind of define that, and maybe as that lays into your overall argument for the constitution of knowledge, as you put it?
Well, thanks. I love the fact that podcast is a medium where you can dive into questions like what is truth, and people won't change the channel. If it hadn't involved the repetition of the word, my subtitle would have been The Defense of Knowledge. So truth it's a direction. It's like north or up. It's where we're headed, but it's not a place we get to. The destination is knowledge, because knowledge is conditional. We hope it's true. And It gets closer and closer to truth over time as we learn more and more. But unlike truth, which is an absolute concept, knowledge is something we build up over time. And we have a special social system that does that. It's a lot like the US Constitution because it forces us to negotiate with each other, have structured conflicts, structured conversations in very particular ways. There are only certain ways you can make laws, and there are only certain ways you can make knowledge. And that's really the key. It's not just people having lots of conversations in an open marketplace. It's all of these rules and institutions that you were trained in, that I was trained in, that makes knowledge possible.
Yeah, no, I think that's wonderful. I want to understand, so I want to get to it, but because I thought your outline of the Constitution and particularly Madison's, key role in it was, I mean, probably some of the best, I think there's like 3 or 4 pages of this kind of exposition. I thought it was just brilliant. You make that distinction between, here's, the U.S. Constitution of what we have here in the United States, but then also how your Constitution of knowledge is a type of mirroring of sorts. Maybe just, tell us how you came across that and using that as a model and what you were trying to kind of achieve there.
Well, so before I ever started this book, I started writing about the Constitution as that saying that what it is fundamentally, it does a lot of things, of course. But ultimately, what it's really doing is forcing compromise, saying the only way you can get something done, pass a law, is to compromise with other people and other factions that have different viewpoints. And that James Madison, the principal genius of the Constitution, is the guy who realized that the only way that you can control ambition, a force that had disrupted and destroyed democracies down through thousands of years, the only way that you can contain ambition is by pitting it against other ambitions. So he has this system that we call checks and balances, where, the president checks the Congress and the courts check both. And then you have state and local and federal and all kinds of other things going on. And this seems crazy, right? Because it makes it so hard to get stuff done. But what it's really doing is saying no one person or faction can take this over. Instead, you're going to have to get lots of other people to agree with you. And there's going to be a process. And what comes out of that will be law. And no, you won't necessarily win, but neither will anyone else. Compromise, it turns out, is a dynamic force. This is one of Madison's greatest insights that people hadn't realized. Many still don't. Compromise isn't just like, splitting the baby in two, splitting the difference. Compromise forces you to go find new allies, new ideas. You and I can't agree on whether to play chess or checkers, so maybe we decide to play cards instead. Maybe we invent a new game. Maybe we go out and talk to a third person and say, what do you think we should play? So this brings new ideas and dynamism. And somewhere along the way, I realized, that's what's inside the black box of our knowledge-making system. It too says, if you want to make knowledge, you can't just have a ruler that will decree what truth is, which is how human society has done it since time immemorial. A priest or a prince or a politburo or something beginning with P would say, here's what we believe. And if you don't like it, we'll throw you in jail or exile you. Right. And then sects would form, and then you'd have civil war, and you'd have a lot of killing and not much knowledge. So then people come along around the same time as the US Constitution, and they say, no, wait, let's have rules instead of rulers. And it turns out the rules are in many ways very similar to the US Constitution rule, because the only way to make knowledge is for me to persuade a lot of other people with a lot of different points of view, using things like experiments, which other people have to be able to replicate, even if they're critical, even if I don't know them, total strangers. I have to be willing to lose the argument and move on, assume the system is smarter than I am. You have to be able to accept results that go against you. So then what I learned is that these two systems are really surprisingly similar in what they're doing. And that's the key actually to making knowledge on a global scale. You have these rules that everyone can follow.
And I mean, I obviously am. So you said at the top that, you're center right, I'm more center left. So, we're holding it down in the center. And so I totally agree with this. I guess the hard part about this is that when you have so many people and so, massive amounts of individuals and groups, how does that scale upward for this type of interdependence of saying, okay, there's this push-pull notion of you have this idea, well, I have a different idea, we find someone else to maybe figure it out, or we go elsewhere and look for something, or it doesn't always have to split the difference. Absolutely. But how do we scale that where we have so many factions, at least in the United States, and you can see this in other countries as well, where that seems very difficult to do? And so how do we, in a concrete or tangible way, how are we able to try and attempt at doing that?
Well, that's more of the secret sauce of the Constitution of Knowledge and the U.S. Constitution. So none of the earlier systems were scalable because, the minute you tried to get too many people to believe the same thing, some people would split off, you'd go to war. Mm-hmm. And the minute you tried to get a society that was too diverse previously, it would split apart. Right. Madison comes along, and again, he has a genius answer to what he called the problem of faction, which is the system getting captured by one group or a handful of groups. And he calls it enlarge the sphere. If you go with a rule-based system, you can expand it almost indefinitely. And he said by bringing in more and more factions with different arguments, different points of view, different preferences, you actually strengthen the system because no one faction can capture it. And that turns out to work in the US Constitution. Our population is now approximately 100 times the size of when the Constitution was written. Our democracy, although of course never completely safe, is much more firmly established than it was then. The knowledge base of the reality-based community, that's what I call, that's basically academia, journalism, government, and law, the communities that are really working within the Constitution of Knowledge. The size of that has grown spectacularly, and it's growing geometrically, meaning, for instance, just between 2006 and 2016, the number of internationally co-authored scientific papers rose in the US by something like 20%. Developing countries are coming online into the global reality-based community. Countries, disciplines, new brains, new thinkers. We now have a global network of people and institutions that can check each other's errors in record times and do incredible things, like a new virus comes along in December, and in January, over 10 days, the thing is sequenced over a weekend. A vaccine is designed. It's in my arm in less than a year. This is because this huge system can pivot quickly and direct literally hundreds of thousands of the best minds in the world and literally thousands of institutions to focus on this problem and figure it out. No other system of building knowledge comes anywhere close to the capabilities of the Constitution of Knowledge, precisely because it's the only system that does scale.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. As an example with the pandemic and the vaccine, again, I've spoken many times of, as much as there's a lot of noise about, the pandemic and the vaccine, it's absolutely astounding to me how we've been able to do that so quickly, relatively speaking, and how it's right. It's in everyone's arms, and or potentially could be. That's a feat of human ingenuity. That's something that's definitely a lot of progress there. And I think some people forget that or take it for granted when they're arguing about certain conspiracy theories or, whether we still should wear masks.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's so easy to forget about this. And so one way I try to think about this to keep myself aware is that what we're talking about with the Constitution of Knowledge is a species transforming technology, literally species transforming. Without it, we're back in our small tribal worlds of inbred clans or tribes or nations struggling along as we did for the first 200,000 years, basically adding approximately zero to the canon of knowledge. In today's world, I couldn't prove this, but I think it's right. On any given day, we add more to the canon of human knowledge in one day than we did in the first 200,000 years. This is, as the psychologist Jonathan Haidt says, this raises our abilities as a species to capabilities that are orders of magnitude higher than our design capacity. It's that important.
Yeah. I want to get to the kind of some of the specifics that you talk about, but before I get there, in the book, especially in the first, I say half of it, I don't know if you explicitly state this, but it seems that you're making the case or making the argument for a type of pragmatic institutionalism, right? In essence, that we need institutions. They're good creations, fallible, but they are good creations that we have, especially in the United States. And using institutions, that's not to say that there isn't room for activism. Of course there is, but in a very pragmatic way to say, how does this apply or fit for different types of people in this country or in different communities through Congress and Supreme Court and the courts and all of these systems we built. That's what's important, right? There's this kind of unifying way of trying to use process and trying to use all of the things with people together, their ideas, and how do we have a good outcome? Is that more or less what you're arguing for, or maybe something different?
I think so. I didn't completely understand the point you were making.
No worries. I'll say that in terms of how I think of pragmatic institutions are this idea of like, I would say someone that's a good example of this is someone like, President Obama, right? I see him as a very pragmatic center left kind of politician that always talked about how do people use and change certain systems, right? How do they, whether that's with voting, whether that's being involved in local community. Obviously, he talked about vote as a way to try and get, certain changes in whether it's civil rights or education, and that using the institutions that we have in place as a way to generate change or to have these types of progressive types of elements. That activism is obviously very important. Grassroots is very important, but operating in these different factions or, someone in this community or in this state or in this county or this district, if everyone's kind of doing their own thing and there's not some kind of way of saying, okay, how do we understand how to use in each one of those places the institutions that are there, things that we've decided, how do we then have change that is impacting and lasting?
Got it this time.
Yeah.
That puts it so well, it would be hard for me to improve on. So that's really kind of in some ways the core of this new book. In my first book on this, Kindly Inquisitors, I had a marketplace of ideas model, and that you got a lot of people, individuals, and they're engaged in public criticism and they find each other's errors, and that's how we get knowledge. And that's all very true. I'm not casting any shade on that, but the part I missed out was the institutional part. The fact that an individual can't have a conversation with a million other individuals in order to isolate a virus or do anything else. Right. We have to talk to each other through these institutions like edited journals, like newsrooms, academic conferences, government agencies, courts of law. And all of these institutions do a few crucial things. First, they organize our conversations. So they say, okay, you come in here to talk about this. Here's how you need to behave. And then we're going to plug you into these other systems. We're going to take your idea. We're going to divide it. Say, can you substantiate it? We're going to send it out to other institutions, maybe fact checkers or maybe peer reviewers or other publications. Maybe they say, okay, we're going to go get a grant and study this idea. But these institutions, they are the critical node where the actual magic is happening because they're the ones that are structuring these vast global conversations and breaking them into bits and then moving them out on the network so that various people and organizations can do various things. They're also doing the teaching. It takes a huge amount of knowledge to participate in the whole reality-based community. Think about the training it takes to be a lawyer, a scientist, for that matter, a journalist. It takes years to get good at that. And the institutions do the teaching, they do the training, they set the standards. They say, look, if you want to be a biochemist, there's some credentials for that. If you want to be a lawyer, there's some ethics rules you need to follow. they create the incentives like the awards in journalism, which help keep journalists beavering away to find truth. So they're the source of learning and discipline and transmission. They are the key. And that's what I missed in the first book.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. And the frustrating thing about this is that in the current state, I mean, I'm sure there are still people that obviously believe in that, but many people have turned their backs on that and say, well, we have to overthrow the system, or, completely transform it, or we have to, we don't need the system anymore. The system is broken in terms of these institutions. And my answer to that usually is, I think nothing's static, right? We need to always be reforming, and we always need to be trying to improve and make it better. But I don't think we do away with those systems or institutions completely, or many of them, I would say. And so I guess this kind of gets to the larger point of what you're saying is, how do you, respond to folks that maybe say, those types of things? If we don't need the system, or it's the system's fault and we need to just, restart, and, what are your kind of responses when folks say things like that?
Well, for one thing, it's not realistic, even in principle. Mm-hmm. There's no other way societies can organize on a scale larger than a small tribe, right, without the kinds of institutions that bring us together and form us and organize us to do projects and teach us rules, and then help us teach other people those rules. Institutions really socialize us. They're where that hard work gets done. So the notion that you can just throw them away and do without them is, it's just completely unsupportable. It's just totally nuts. But it also goes to something that you mentioned earlier that's I think really critical. There have been two things that have happened over the last 50 years that have really damaged the way Americans treat our institutions and think about them. And one is 50 years of attack from the right and from the left and from the libertarians, all saying various versions of institutions are corrupt, they are incompetent, our elites are rigging the system, you can't trust them. Now, these different factions had different ways of doing this. On the left, there was deconstructionism, saying that these institutions are just all projecting illegitimate power that oppresses groups. And on the right, you had this kind of populism that people like Rush Limbaugh and Sarah Palin embodied. Limbaugh used to say, it's what he called the four corners of deceit, meaning academia, science, journalism, and government. You can't trust any of them. Right. Trump takes that to the next level. And then libertarians saying, you can't trust politicians, you can't trust government, they never work, blow them up. Not all libertarians, but that was a theme. Well, you can't have 50 years of relentless attack on institutions without damaging people's confidence in them, and that's what's happened. But then the second thing's even more profound, and you alluded to it, which is when institutions work well, they disappear. They're the water we swim in if we're fish. We take for granted that we go to work and work for an employer that has lots of institutional background and knowledge. We go to school. We kind of forget all the work that's gone into building that. So when they work, we take them for granted, and we just think of ourselves as free agents, just individuals, just floating around out here doing our thing, having a good time, having a bad time. It's only when they start to fail, when they start getting attacked and breaking down, that we have to pause and think, oh, wait a minute. We needed all this stuff. And what you said is kind of profound. If you haven't yet had Yuval Levin on your show and his book, A Time to Build, this has been, to me, one of the key books of the last 10 years, because Yuval really works through how we overshot from the 50s, where we did reform institutions in important ways. I'm gay, believe me, I can tell you all about the shortcomings of overbearing, straitjacketed, conformist institutions. But then we overshot, and we went the direction that you indicated. And he writes brilliantly about how we need to go back to appreciating institutions and building them again instead of tearing them down.
I mean, you and I are completely simpatico on this. I totally agree. And I think now, and I think you're right, I think this would get to the latter part of what I wanted to discuss is, it's this fight for that. And all of a sudden fighting for that is somehow fighting for elites or fighting for a system. And you're fighting with that, on the left and the right nowadays. And so I think the center has to hold, and I think it has to, because for me, much of the things that many progressives, shoot for and aim for, the way that happens is through this type of, pragmatic institutionalism, and how we're able to use systems and institutions that we've created. And so I think we just need to keep reforming them and putting pressure on them to keep working for us and not going away and working maybe not against us, but forgetting about many people. I think that's healthy to do. But I think
I can speak to that in my own life.
Yeah.
I'm, homosexual American man, born in 1960. The idea that I could ever marry someone of my own sex was completely ludicrous. In those days, we couldn't even be physically intimate without risking arrest.
Yeah.
Couldn't work for the government, couldn't serve in the military. Psychiatry said we were sick, on and on and on. And here I am married to a man. Well, there's certainly a role for street activism in the gay rights movement and in the L+, LGBTQ, et cetera, movement. But so often we forget, how do we get marriage? Well, one thing is we work through the courts. We had some of the best lawyers in the game who worked for years, strategizing, figuring out the cases, marshaling the evidence, going to courts. Eventually, we worked through the legislatures, but we also worked through the Constitution of Knowledge. My role in same-sex marriage, which was the big thing in my life for 15 years, 1995 to 2010, was to make public arguments about why this was such an important needed change, and not just because of fairness, but because it's a great social stabilizer. It gives gay people a destination for our love. It helps us give back to the community. Well, I could have stood out on the street corner with a sign and said that, but I went through the institutions. I wrote for Wall Street Journal, New Republic, The Atlantic, anywhere that would publish me. I would go to universities and do debates. All of these institutions were the places I was able to plug into and say, okay, here are the arguments. And they would have to take those seriously. Maybe not initially, but pretty darn quickly. So people forget, if you really want social change, these institutions are the nodes that you want to work with.
I completely agree. It's funny. I was telling my wife this, something similar the other day, which was, to me, how far and how fast we went with gay rights in this country is literally the kind of poster child of how to do it. Is how do you not just have activism, but how do you use institutions there and make that change? And, it really kind of, I think, got there to 2012 or whichever year it was. And 50 years before that, it was completely just not even so, it's not even just the legal change, and it's not even just all the particulars, but it was the social change. I mean, even now in the United States, it's 75, 80%, people see it favorably. Okay, that's well over majority now. It's that also is exactly what you're saying. I think one of the ways you do that is, yes, activism, but legally, how do you do it in journalism? How do you do it in science? How do you do it in all these domains using institutions? To me, that is the best example in the modern era that we have of how to make real change for people and individuals at a mass scale, and get, at least, the bare minimum, at least, equal rights for that group in that population. And so,
yeah, I agree. It's really stunning.
Yes.
I didn't think I'd live to see it. And we mustn't forget the critical role that knowledge played, the Constitution of Knowledge. People, for the most part, don't wake up thinking, who can I hate on today? I mean, a few do. You got your skinheads and whatever. But most people who are haters or who are discriminators are operating out of fear and ignorance. And if you believe that homosexuals are trying to recruit your children, subvert American democracy, bring down God's wrath on the entire country, then you're going to hate homosexuals. And the key step in this process was showing people that was wrong. It was a process of discovery and then of education. A key moment was the science that was done in the 1950s to debunk the psychiatric notion that we were sick. Some people did some blind studies and said, okay, psychiatrists, here's a mix of people. Tell me which ones are the homosexuals based on these batteries of personality tests that are supposed to indicate who's sick and who's not. Well, guess what? They couldn't tell because there was no difference. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association and Institution changes its policy and changes the diagnostic standards. So gay people it's no longer considered mentally ill to be homosexual. Frank Kameny, the main activist who got that done, PhD himself, used to call it the greatest mass cure in history. So this is just essential, the development of knowledge. And it breaks my heart that so many minority rights activists now view free speech and objectivity as the enemies, when in fact they are the greatest weapons for social justice that have ever been invented.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's probably one of the bigger issues. Right before we get to that, I do wanted to ask about the tenets of Constitution of Knowledge. In the book, you talk about things such as these common cores of fallibilism, objectivity, pluralism, institutionalism, et cetera. Maybe just say a little bit about those kind of common cores and how we can try to promote the Constitution of Knowledge more widely for people.
Well, I think I list 7 or 8 in the book. I don't candidly have it in front of me, and I can't remember what they all are.
Yeah, those are a few of them.
So the bigger idea there is that you have some, formal rules and institutions that we work through in the Constitution of Knowledge, like, ways that you're going to have to present your evidence if you're an academic, and places that you're going to need to do it, peer-reviewed journals. And, similarly with journalism and law and government, they all have their structures. But the founding fathers of the US Constitution warned that the Constitution itself, for all of the stuff that it sets up, Congress, courts, all the rest of it, that was just words on paper. If you didn't have what they called Republican virtue, civic virtue, and what they meant by that is a public which actually believes in the ethos of the Constitution and believes things like it's okay to lose an election. The Republic goes on. You can't do January 6th within the boundaries of Republican virtue. And things like be an informed voter, rotation in office, honesty, just a certain amount of truthfulness is implied by living together in a democracy. And they said without those things, you can't have a democracy, you can't have a constitution. Basically, John Adams said without those things that illiberal forces, he had a different word, but they'll go through the Constitution the way a whale goes through a net. And the same is true of the Constitution of Knowledge. I mean, you can have all of the systems in the world, but if you don't have people who have some of the traits that you mentioned, it's not going to work. And those traits are, you mentioned fallibilism. So that's the idea that I might be wrong.
Right.
And no matter how sure I am that I'm right, no matter how obvious it seems, I could always be mistaken. That's the beginning of the whole system, because without that, I don't have to take anyone else seriously, and I can go out, start my own reality and think, well, why should I even tolerate wrong-headed views? A related one is epistemic humility. People get that wrong a lot. It doesn't mean that I walk into every conversation unsure of what I think or thinking I might be wrong. In fact, in the Constitution of Knowledge, like the US Constitution, you actually need strong opinions, strong views, because you're pitting them against each other, right, to either make policy or find truth. So you need those engines of people who really feel passionate about their ideas. So what epistemic humility means is understanding that even though I think I'm right, I might be wrong, but even more than that, understanding the system is smarter than I am. That as smart and as certain as I am, that when I run ideas through this big global network of people looking for errors, doing all kinds of things, that it's likely to be right in the end. So if people don't believe that, there's no reason to do science. I mean, I'll just work off of revelation. Institutionalism, another one you mentioned, that's what we just talked about. So we don't need to elaborate much, but that's being willing to invest in and support homes for teaching, the places that do the hard work of setting standards, participating in all that, and not doing exactly what you alluded to earlier, which is just taking a burn, baby, burn attitude to all that, thinking you're better off on your own. Maybe the most important of all of these civic virtues is the same in both the constitutional republic and the republic of science. And that's respect for accuracy, veracity, no bullshitting. You know, there are places and times for bullshitting, but when you're doing the search for knowledge, it's no good to say something that's very appealing politically, but not true. Like trans people of color started the Stonewall riots in 1969. It would be in some ways nice if that were true, but it's not. So a lot of people then say, well, that's okay if people believe it because there will be good effects from people from establishing this as sort of a popular concept. And the answer is no. If you're making knowledge, accuracy is job one. Truthiness does not count. No bullshitting, no lying, no bending the truth. Your job, if you're a professional, is to get it right. And if you're not right, to correct your mistakes. No sin in making a mistake. Right. Happens all the time. In fact, the genius of the Constitution of Knowledge is not that it doesn't make mistakes, it's that it makes them so quickly and finds them so quickly. It doesn't shoot you if you're wrong. You know, you don't lose your job. You just lose the argument, and that's fine. But you do have to be willing to strap yourself to actual facts where they exist and to try to find actual facts where they don't exist.
Yeah, I think all of that is something that, you know, really resonates with me. And I think that, you know, as I think about all these things, it's something that's, you know, my pool is how do we, you know, get people to have some buy-in to this, which leads into my next point, which is in the book, you talk about this type of positive epistemic valence, specifically, I think in journalism, and now it's just flipped. And, you know, it seems to be that there's this negative epistemic valence in journalism. And then I think it applies to mass media as a whole. Maybe just say a little bit of that generally about, you know, how you see that kind of switch and why that's problematic.
Yeah, I'd love to. So one of the really interesting riddles of where knowledge comes from is what is it about our system that gives it what I call positive epistemic valence, which just means that over time, truer ideas are likely to emerge from it than less true ideas. So the system will tend toward truth. That turns out to be very unusual because in most social systems for deciding what's true and what's false, like say a system that's strictly religious or a system that relies on oracles or sacred texts, they'll do the opposite. They'll just wander further and further from truth. So positive epistemic valence means that they're truth friendly. It's favoring truth. Where does that come from? In our system, you can think of all of these institutions that we talked about, you know, the journals and the peer review, the fact checkers, the newsrooms, the scientific agencies, the law courts. Think of them as like pumping and filtering stations. And each one of them is acquiring hypotheses from other actors in the system. And it's weighing them, it's evaluating them. It's fact checking them, it's peer reviewing them, it's deciding whether it's worth going to get a research grant to do experiments on. It's parceling it out to other parts of the system. And each one of those nodes is saying, what are the chances that this statement is true? So they don't all get it right all the time. And there's no one gatekeeper because there's infinite pathways through this network. I imagine them as being like pumping and filtering stations where they filter out the bad stuff and then pump the good stuff onto the next station. But if the odds there are that 25% chance that bad stuff gets through any given station, it dies out on the network very quickly. If the odds are 75% that true stuff gets through the network, it passes through very quickly. And that's the magic that leads to knowledge being the outcome of this system. It's like filtering in the good stuff and filtering out the bad stuff. So then along comes social media, and it operates on very different premises, digital media generally. Its premise is we're not going to filter for epistemic valence, that is truth value. That is this actually accurate? Is it correct? We're going to filter for attractiveness to eyeballs. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to sell those eyeballs to advertisers. Well, if that's what you're doing, you don't care at all about truth. You're building algorithms and they're saying, well, is it sticky? Is it not sticky? It turns out that outrage is very sticky. We can't keep away from it. Right. Made up stuff, conspiracy theories, very interesting, very exciting, get us wound up, very sticky. So now you flip the pumps. Yeah. So now actually what they're doing is filtering out the truthful stuff and filtering in the sensationalistic stuff, mm-hmm. and the outrage and the conspiracy theories. And now you got a system which is actually spewing out the bilge and filtering out the truth. And that is a very, very unproductive way to do it. So the dilemma we have now is, so how can we rewire these pumps and filters in the digital epistemic realms so that they'll do something like what the non-digital realm does so well, which is incentivize, move through the system, amplify true stuff instead of false stuff. And that's what so many minds at places like Facebook and Google and all the others are wrestling with right now.
Well, you're right. And I think that, the kind of visual you give is very helpful. And, when I was reading this in the book, my first question that popped up to me, and I think it's a little bit of both, but, where does this responsibility ultimately lie, right? Is the responsibility on the individual user of mass media to follow and participate with the rules of the constitution of knowledge, which we just discussed? Or does it rather behoove the major media companies that, to have more professional conduct and practice in how they disseminate information or how they're allowing for that or how they're, guarding against that, et cetera? Where does this responsibility lie?
Can I say both?
That's fine.
Can I say that in a way that the framing of the question actually leads us astray, because institutions and individuals form and make each other. The institutions can't work if the individuals reject their legitimacy or won't follow the rules, or won't teach others to follow in their footsteps. But the individuals also can't thrive without the social organization they get from the institutions, the way to plug into the networks with other people, the resources that they bring, the social support, the knowledge that's embedded in. Just think about, if you work for a university, think about the knowledge that's embedded in that institution, which you have access to when you plug in there. Yeah. So the Constitution of Knowledge, it rejects that distinction. It says you have to have both. And that's what James Madison said about the US Constitution too. You need to have the institutional structures, and you also need to have individuals who have civic virtue. And they then need to have a positive spiral where they're supporting each other instead of fighting each other. And that's what we need to try to replicate now in, say, the world of digital media. You got to make consumers more aware of, say, not retweeting a conspiracy theory just because it's appealing. But you also need institutions to change the incentives and how those platforms work to incentivize people to do that and support them when they do. Twitter's doing that now. If you try to retweet a link that you haven't actually read first, you'll be interrupted. You'll get a banner will pop up and saying, are you sure you don't want to read this before you retweet it? Well, that's an institution's way of slowing people down, saying, think a minute, you sure you know what you're doing? We rely on institutions to do that for us every day. Slow us down, make us think, make us talk to others, consult with others. So social media is starting to figure out, can we replicate some of those institutional functions? So if you get it going right, the two reinforce each other in a positive spiral. So far, unfortunately, the downward spiral has been the spiral we've seen instead.
Yeah. I guess kind of along with that is, how do you see this relationship then between identities and institutions? So I guess, personal identities, because some people will say, well, they want to opt out of the system. I don't want to be a part of this as much as they can. I don't know if that's really, if you're living in a society, in a modern society, I think there's limits to that. But what do you think about this relationship between identities, personal identities, and institutions? And, why do you think that there's a sort of shift there of, identities are being more lauded, but institutions are being, lambasted of sorts. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it might sound like a broken record in my praise for the liberal order generally, constitution of knowledge specifically, but one of its greatest traits is actually that it leaves people space to have their individual identities and also to have their own separate epistemic spheres, meaning communities of belief. Most systems that regulate knowledge, like monarchies that say the king decides, or a church that says the high priest decides, or really any other, don't really leave room for personal dissent and freedom of belief, because any dissenter is potentially an attack on the whole system. So they tend to be totalistic. They're going to try to regulate every aspect of your life. Liberal systems like the US Constitution, like the Constitution of Knowledge, say, no, wait a minute. The sphere of these constitutions is limited. So we're deciding public law or we're deciding public knowledge. That's the things that we think are facts, that we accept for purposes of making public policy. Like, you may think Elvis Presley is alive, but no, we're not going to send him a Social Security check. Or, and similar with the US Constitution, there are only certain things that you have to do to make a law, but neither system regulates what you do in church, what you do at home. I mean, you don't have to follow the First Amendment at home in your family. You don't have to be a scientist around the dinner table and perform experiments when you say something. You can have separate realms. One of the great examples of that, one of the world's most brilliant and important scientists, Francis Collins, director of the National Institutes of Health, is a devout Christian.
Right.
He can go to church and be in that realm where he's not doing experiments to prove the divinity of Jesus Christ, and then put on his day job and be part of the Constitution of Knowledge. So that freedom to have these separate identities, to live in multiple realms freely, that is one of the greatest gifts of liberalism. People don't understand that. But that's where that freedom comes from. The conflict only arises when people, I'm gay, right? So I have a personal identity. It's very important in structuring my life. It's been very important in my outlook. And I frequently, when I argue for gay marriage, I will say, as a gay person, my experience has been X, my belief has been Y. The important thing is that in the Constitution of Knowledge, when I assert my identity, I'm saying that as a form of information. I'm giving you context. I'm saying, here's where I'm coming from. I'm explaining my credentials. And you're taking in that information. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing. We want people to say, as an African American, as a Jew, as an atheist. The problem comes when you try to use those credentials to stop the conversation. When I'm presenting that not as information to be considered, but as a unique credential that only I have, that disqualifies other points of view. And that's, only Jews can talk about Zionism. Only gay people can talk about the gay experience in America, or equal rights and so forth. Unfortunately, that's what we see a lot of.
Yeah. I totally agree with that, and I think it's strange how that's become. We boost identity or overindulge identity, and I think you're absolutely right. And how do we use it as a source of knowledge but not let it go too far? I guess one question about some of the stuff we've been talking about is we're talking about this Constitution of Knowledge in a positive light, more or less. And I guess my question would be, what about the dark side of human nature, right? So if you ask evolutionary psychologists, they'll tell you that the way that we have order and we do things and we create hierarchies and systems is through dominance, power, aggression, and we've done that throughout many thousands of years. If you ask social psychologists, many of them will say, well, we know that cooperation, we know that they're, through kindness, through many of these other lighter sides of things, that's how we are able to create some type of interdependence. And I think Joe Henrich does a both sides here, and he has a model of saying, well, it's both. And we see that. We see both. You can use both sort of systems to have humans cooperate. But in this sense, there is this dark side of human nature, right? The need to dominate, the selfishness, et cetera, that does exist, obviously. So knowledge can sometimes be used as an instrument of destruction. And how do we factor for that within the constitution of knowledge? How do we make sure that we're not allowing that variance, right? Obviously, you want to be protective of free speech and things like that, but how do we kind of factor for that?
Do you mean things like, developing nuclear weapons and, maybe wiping ourselves off the planet, that kind of dark side?
Yeah, that's definitely one example for sure. It doesn't have to be as dramatic as that. It could also be like, how do we use certain knowledge, right, to create certain, certain viruses or certain things, and that could be potentially damaging.
Yeah, right. People worry that people could now reconstruct smallpox because we know the genome, build it in the lab and release it. Yeah. So the dilemma, the question you raised, it's like maybe the most fundamental question in philosophy, the state of nature, the human dark side, the conflict between Hobbes and Rousseau. Hobbes said the state of nature is war of all against all, nasty, brutish, and short. And that the only way to get out of that was a totalitarian monarch. Yeah. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, no, the state of nature is that we're naturally given to cooperation, building society, and it's actually civilization that squashes that and turns us bad. And that's a huge and deep debate. It seems like in the world of knowledge, the world of truth seeking, that the dark side has the advantage because it turns out humans are not really very well wired to find truth in abstract matters, big questions, like small things where we get immediate feedback and it's life or death. Like, is that a tiger in the bush or just the breeze, or where's the next tribe camp? We're pretty good at that. Right. But on the bigger questions, like what's the cause of this disease that's afflicting our population, or which God should we worship? That's where the dark side emerges. Because what we're inclined to do, since we're social creatures, is look at what the people around us believe and then see if we can find beliefs that will raise our status and confirm our identity, because that feels really good. It's a lot of what QAnon is about right now. I find this group online and wow, I'm a mover and shaker here because I can spread new conspiracy ideas, and suddenly I have friends online and status, and I'm an insider. I know stuff. So the dark side tends to reign over time unless we constrain it. Yeah. And that's why we need all of these rules. And it's why we need all of these institutions to force us, whether we like it or not, and often if we don't like it, to submit our impulses, to rush to judgment, to have biased beliefs, to be overly certain that we're right, to submit all that to this global depersonalized network, this reality-based community that says, hang on a minute, let's see what these other people think. Let's see if you're following the rules. Let's submit it to people who are following the rules. It slows us down. It subjects us to others. It harnesses the only force that is actually successful in fighting bias, and that's bias. We don't see our own errors. We don't see our own bias, but other people see our biases and errors. They don't see their own either. So what the system does is it fights the dark side by harnessing the dark side. So a little like Adam Smith saying that, it's not the altruism of the butcher or baker that puts food on our table. It's self-interest. If we want to advance knowledge and, get a Nobel Prize or a Pulitzer, we're going to have to meet all these rules and standards that expose us to all of these other people and all of the criticisms that they're going to have for us and all of the standards that they're going to impose on us. So the dark side is there. It's just better controlled and harnessed.
Yeah. And it goes back to the earlier point of, we're everyone should be and everyone is in a sense allowed to be a part of that dialogue of of ideas within communities, within societies, and to use those things for institutions. So I guess kind of a few more questions here is you talk about a few things in the second half of the book, which I know you've spoken about elsewhere as well, is you talk about misinformation and disinformation, and then also troll epistemology. So maybe just kind of briefly give us the distinction that you make between misinformation and disinformation, and then how you kind of lay out your case of how troll epistemology has really kind of taken a life of its own currently.
Well, what people usually say is that misinformation is stuff that's just wrong, that has a tendency to spread. And disinformation is wrong stuff that's spread on purpose with a political goal in mind. In practice, it's very hard to distinguish, so I don't really dwell on the distinction. And I instead talk about another concept, which is information warfare, or actually, I think a better term is epistemic warfare. And the things you mentioned are part of that: trolling, disinformation, cancel culture, and others. So the best way to think about epistemic warfare is that it's an attempt to organize and manipulate the social and media environments for political advantage, and specifically to divide, disorient, dominate, and ultimately demoralize an opponent. That's what Vladimir Putin is trying to do in the 2020 election, as well as at home. And there are all kinds of ways to do that. And one of them is troll epistemology. So what happens in the constitution of knowledge, in the reality-based community, no one gets personally executed for being wrong. The core of that is that we punish our hypotheses. We kill our hypotheses instead of each other. So then what do we do about things that are wrong? Well, we basically ignore them. They just fall by the wayside. They don't pass through the system of pumps and filters. They get screened out and people forget about them and they go away. And the way we do that is by directing resources and attention. So the good ideas will get the research grants, and then the research grants may say, well, this one worked out, this panned out, it needs even more money, let's develop it. So what happens if you subvert all that by saying, wait a minute, we're going to start introducing material in this system which is fine-tuned and engineered to hijack people's attention. So even if they try, they cannot not focus on it. How do you do that? Outrage, conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are attractive, and if we refute them, we repeat them and embed them. If we ignore them, they just spread even more. They create this impossible situation. Trolling, that's using outrage when our community or our core beliefs are outraged, or when crazy lies are told about us. We rise to the bait. We can't not defend ourselves or our group. Even if we know that we're being exploited and manipulated, we'll still feel like, well, I can't just ignore this, can I? These are powerful tools to subvert the constitution of knowledge by hijacking our attention and refocusing it. This is Hitler in Mein Kampf talks about trolling, what we now call trolling. And what he says is that it doesn't matter if they insult us or laugh at us. What matters is that they can't stop thinking about us. This is why Donald Trump was committing outrages multiple times a day and doing it on purpose. And one day there was a bad press story about Ivanka, something she had done with her brand. So he sends out a tweet demanding that Israel refuse visas to liberal members of Congress. Now, he knows that's not going to happen, and Israel knows it's not going to happen, but he also knows that people all over the country are going to rise up and shout, that's intolerable, that's incredible, how can you say that? And he actually says to his aides, well, that'll disrupt them for the rest of the news cycle. And he's right. So these are powerful, powerful tactics. They've been in use for a long time. They've now been turbocharged by the speed at which they can move across social media and digital media. And then the biggest change of all, which is the rise of Trump and his movement. Trump is the greatest avatar and innovator of mass-scale Russian-style disinformation since the 1930s. And he's very good at using these tools.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's frustrating because everyone said, well, if we just vote him out and he's gone, it's yeah, he's gone, but there's meaning he's not in the Oval Office, but there's an imprint that he has left and continues to leave, and I think that's very detrimental for the health of our society.
I'm so glad you made that observation, because if you read the book, you'll see that there's as much or more about the threat of social coercion, what's now called cancel culture. That's, using lots of social techniques to isolate and intimidate people. You put pressure on their jobs, on their professional connections, their friendships, their reputation, and they'll often just cower.
Yeah.
Because the reason there's kind of equal emphasis is that I wrote the book before November 3rd, 2020. And I thought, well, 2/3 chance that Joe Biden will be president and Donald Trump will have gone away. And it'll seem obsolete to talk about troll epistemology and Russian style disinformation. Well, boy, was I ever wrong. What we've seen is that these tactics have now been embraced by conservative media, by Republican politicians, and especially by the Republican base. They are now driving the conspiracy narratives. The politicians are now following the base into these Alice in Wonderland worlds of fakery. And they're spiraling downward, chasing each other. It turns out you don't need Donald Trump himself to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Once you develop a community that's committed to disinformation and gets political advantage, and by the way, it feels really good. I mean, who wants to believe you lost the election if you can believe that a ring of Democratic pedophiles stole it?
Mm-hmm.
That's way more fun.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now what we see is that this problem transcends any one actor. It's embedded in a whole sector of our politics. And I think it's by far the biggest epistemic threat that we face today, and the biggest we've faced since at least the 1850s.
Yeah, I agree. And the thing that makes me the most sad and frustrated about it is that I always I'm such a big believer in humanity. Yeah. And even obviously for people that I disagree with. And when I see people doing this and when they're engaging in outrage and cancel culture and disinformation and conspiracies, it frustrates me. It makes me sad, because it's like, imagine if people applied themselves and they would use that time and energy to create, to make something, to contribute that's more active and positive, and less of this, just this kind of vile swamp of bullshit. And it's frustrating because it's like junk food, right? It's the McDonald's for things. It's not, it feels good in the moment, and who doesn't like a Big Mac sometimes, but it's not nutritious for you. It's not for your social or political health. And people don't like eating the salad, but long term you're going to live longer and be healthier. And I wish there was more of that. And I guess it saddens in me. It makes me frustrated.
That's a brilliant point, which I never thought of before, and which I'm going to take forward, which is the stupendous waste of intellectual energy and talent that's being poured down these rat holes of conspiracy theories. I remember years ago, an opponent of the war on drugs was pointing to all the energy and entrepreneurial talent that was going into the illegal market for drugs. I mean, think about what's involved in organizing all that and distributing it and all the ingenuity. Say, imagine if you could take all of that entrepreneurial talent and turn it to legal, wholesome ends. Imagine all of the entrepreneurial skill we'd bring online. And the same is true. The people who believe conspiracy theories and who engage in extreme partisanship and all the rest of it, the evidence shows that they are not stupid people. In fact, the smarter you are, the better you are at rationalizing crazy stuff. You take all of that intellectual horsepower, and you actually turn it into a way to justify these biases. It's all a question of, again, back to the same point, the institutional setting you're in. If your institutional setting is rewarding you for finding truth, being accurate, uncovering new information, that's what you'll tend to do. If it's rewarding the opposite, then that's what you'll tend to do. And just imagine if all of these people these vast numbers now that are doing QAnon. Mm-hmm. Imagine if we could engage them in the world of building knowledge. Imagine the perspectives, the talent, the ideas that they could bring in. That is so important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I again, that's the humanist in me, and I try as best I can in my part of the world to do that, but I do wish that. So, last question here, John, because I know you're a busy guy, is what do we do? How do we become more courageous and we fight for kind of the liberal values of the United States and the Republic? How do we fight for those things against this sea of the woke mob and conspiracy, QAnon stuff and cancel culture and all these things? How do we navigate this climate we're in, where we can better be using this constitution of knowledge and we can do many of the things that you lay out in the book? What are your thoughts or ideas about that pragmatically?
Well, there's tons of that in the book. Mm-hmm. And the answer is kind of frustrating because, you want to be able to say, here are the 3 things that you need to do. But this is not the first large epistemic disruption we've had. One was the invention of the printing press. Well, that caused wars to rage across Europe for about a century and killed at one point, people estimate, maybe 30% of population of today's Germany, just for example. We don't want to do it that way. We did a lot better with the rise of offset printing and the penny press in the 19th century, where initially we had media that was just steeped in extreme partisanship and fake news. And that went on for a long time and became toxic. And we got that straightened out, actually, by building some institutions and guardrails like the American Society of Newspaper Editors, which promulgated ethics codes and guidelines like be accurate and run corrections, things we take for granted in my business today, and incentives like prizes and training like journalism school. So it took a while, but that's one aspect. It's going to be the kind of top-down solutions of institutions figuring out what adjustments they need to make in their own realm to get a handle on these problems. These are wicked problems. It's really hard.
Yeah.
But the good news is that the smart people at Facebook, for example, and other digital media companies, which 5 years ago were saying, look, it's not our job to police speech or decide what's true. We're just bringing you what people say, have realized that there is no alternative but to figure out ways to make their systems more friendly to truth instead of being unfriendly to truth. That's just causing too much harm to their customers and society and their own businesses. So those minds are now thinking about it. You've got some developments like Facebook's oversight board, which I think is exactly the right kind of thing to try. It's what worked in the past, creating guidelines, guardrails, being transparent about it. Here's what we expect. If those work, if they improve the environment, then others will adopt them. Mm-hmm. And you need institutional leadership from places like universities so that they don't cave in when factions put pressure to investigate or even fire someone for saying something that's deemed politically incorrect. So you need the top-down stuff. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of that that's going on. But then there's also the bottom-up stuff. And those are the things that you and I can do. Mm-hmm. Everyone, well, not everyone, but most of the people listening to this podcast are plugged into institutions and part of the constitution of knowledge one way or another. They might be a lawyer, they might be a doctor, they might work in the government, they might be an academic, a journalist. In all of our institutions and in our personal lives, we can look for ways to strengthen the constitution of knowledge by, for example, insisting on accuracy in ourselves and in others. If someone in our environment is being canceled, that is ganged up on, harassed, bullied, intimidated, being threatened because they're perceived to have said the wrong thing, defend that person. Mm-hmm. Often that doesn't happen. Yeah. People often dive under the furniture. Well, don't die under the furniture. If you're a leader in one of these organizations, you can promulgate a culture that says, you know what, we're going to follow knowledge, even if it's unpopular. Citizens now are organizing on behalf of liberal values and the Constitution of Knowledge. They're forming groups like the Academic Freedom Alliance and the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values and the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. I could go on, but these are groups that individuals are forming to defend these values in their own environments, in their workplaces, in their universities, in their schools. So all of us can do something to understand what the Constitution of Knowledge is, how it defends us from oppression and ignorance every day, and then figure out what can I do in my institution, in my community, in my life to hold up those values. And if we do that, we are on the way to recovery.
Yeah, I agree 100% with everything you said. And, I got to say, John, you are leading the charge and being a champion for very good, radical, pragmatic centrism, which makes me so very happy. And I hope that people really heed to what you're saying and, get your book and really just kind of download all of your, wonderful information. I was going to say, this is so fantastic to talk with you. I was excited to talk to you, and I'm really glad we did. Tell folks where they can buy your book, where they can find you online or read your stuff, and any other relevant places. Sure.
Twist my arm. The book is The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. It's available everywhere right now. There's an ebook edition and a very well-read audiobook edition. I have a website, jonathanrauch.com, where I post a lot of my writings, not all of them. And you can also find me in my place of employment. I'm very fortunate to be based at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C.
That's great. John, thank you so much for coming on and for your important message and everything you've had to say. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a privilege and a joy to talk with you.
Thanks.